How to balance economic growth, social development, and environmental protection. In a world of growing protectionist trends, how can we respond to the concerns of the people who feel they were left behind? And what can or should be the role of businesses? This has been the weakest economic recovery in global history, 7 years after the financial crisis. But it's been a fantastic time if you've been an owner of assets, property, stocks, bonds across the world. Inequality was rising in many countries before the financial crisis hit, but in the aftermath, it has turbocharged. The pie is growing more slowly than it used to be, and a larger share of that pie is going to the people right at the top. The ones at the bottom are the ones hardest hit by climate change and environmental degradation. The popularity of leaders in the largest democratic states has fallen over the last decade. The mood is very much anti-establishment, and this is not necessarily linked to ideology. The world is turning more inward, not only in economic terms. Barriers to entry are also imposed on people as measures to demonstrate political actions to deal with terror. This is part of what is setting the stage for so much global frustration. Yet, given the prospects of a slower world economic growth, it is important to remember that over the last decades, the number of people living in abject poverty, an income of less than $1.25 per day, has fallen from 2 billion in 1980 to just over 1 billion today. Overall, we've seen an increase in life expectancy across the world. Behind the increased lifespan lies an impressive drop in child mortality. Girls are getting better education, an important step on the long road to gender equality. A warm welcome, everyone, to Global Outlook Norway, which is hosted for the third time by the 3 business clusters here in southern Norway, Eide-nettverket, Maritimt Forum, and GCE Node, again raising important questions to the top of the agenda. It is our genuine hope that the hours we invest here will open up for constructive debate, give you new input, or more importantly, insight to act. Today, you have more computing power than what it took to land Apollo on the moon over 40 years ago. Nevertheless, I ask you to put that potential on hold and turn your tablets and mobiles on silent mode. Still, we would like you to use that computing power by silently sharing your insights from this event. The hashtag is Global Outlook Norway. My name is Helene Løken. When I'm not here, I work for Norwegian, a globally expanding airline headquartered in Norway, which is challenging, even disrupting, the modus operandi of the airline industry. You will now hear from politicians, opinion leaders, and experts who will shed light on some of the key disrupting forces and hopefully bring forth solutions. I am sure there are some keynote listeners in the audience as well to act on their insights. We will aim to open up for questions after the presentation. You can just SMS your question to the dedicated number. Please make your question as short and succinct as possible. I now have the pleasure to introduce Øystein Djupedal, the program committee leader for this fantastic week here in Arendal, to wish us all a welcome and introduce our first distinguished speaker. Welcome.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, dear friends, it's once again my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to Arendal and welcome you all to Global Outlook. It's indeed a pleasure for me once again to see you all here. And indeed, it's a pleasure that now Global Outlook has become a permanent part of Arendals Week. Arendalsuka, or the Arendals Week, is the biggest political event in Norway, which gathers all the major political leaders and organizations and business. And we are proud that it can happen here in Arendal, and we're proud that you're here as well. It's also my privilege once again to introduce the first speaker. Børge Brende, who is Minister of Foreign Affairs, is an old friend from Trondheim. We represented the same constituency back there when we both were in the parliament. We represented different parties. I've changed party, Børge has not changed party, but we had many, many years together. We were both frontbenchers, and we enjoyed the political debate. Always opponents, but always friends. I have quit politics, Børge is still in politics, and he has managed to be respected in all political parties for his job as Minister of Foreign Affairs. And it's my pleasure once again, Børge, to introduce you to the stage. It's nice to have you here. There you are. Welcome. And the stage is yours.
Thank you to Øystein Djupedal, my good friend. He's taken this with the disruptive world very seriously, so he's now changed a bit of his even outlook. Huh? But that can happen when things are changing so fast. And also compliments to Arendal and to the program committee headed by Øystein. He's been one of the primus inter pares in what we have seen established here in Arendal that is quite unique. It's become really the start of the political season in Norway. But since the world is also more and more influencing domestic politics in Norway, I guess, and I have seen from this year's program here in Arendal, that it has much more of an international angle to it than before. International politics have become domestic politics due to the fact that what is happening around the world, if it is related to economics, or if it's related to security policy and politics, what is happening around the world will eventually also happen in your country. So having a voice, and a strong voice globally, also means that you will have influence on how your country and how your village or city looks in the future. And in a globalized world, where what happens in Brazil also affects us in Norway and vice versa, and the challenges that we are seeing just now is staggering, and they are and things are happening so fast, and there is an unpredictability related to this of a magnitude that I think we have to look at what is taking place also in a historical context to really grasp this. And Winston Churchill is always relevant, but in a world where we are seeing some, and especially in Europe, that some things from our past that we didn't think could be repeated and shouldn't be repeated in the future is there as a potential challenge. I didn't think we would see this, but we have to be open and candid about this situation. I think that Churchill's words are more really relevant than ever. Winston Churchill once said that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. I think we can learn a lot from history. Not at least we can learn a lot of the mistakes from history. And this was what the political leaders and the business leaders and thought leaders decided after Second World War. Never war again in Europe. Remember, this part of the world was then the Middle East, where all the wars, a lot of them anyway, started because of ambitions from different countries. There were minorities. There was a very complex picture. First World War, Second World War. But since 1945, in this part of the world, we have seen an unparalleled development, economically, politically, and also when it comes to stability. We got NATO in 1949. We got the Coal and Steel Union in the 50s that ended up to become the European Union. The leaders said that we don't want to go back to this situation in the 30s or even before, where you had this concept of a zero-sum world. So a concept where if your country does well, it is bad for me, and vice versa. What they decided after 1945 was that if you do well, this is good for you, but it also helps me. And I think this was, in a nutshell, illustrated by the Marshall support from the US. The US, also the largest global economy at that time, said that it is, of course, a humanitarian imperative to support Europe when it is hit so hard by the Second World War. But it's also in our interest that Europe succeeds. A Europe that is thriving, a Europe that is growing, we can trade with, and this is a win-win situation. And this win-win concept has been the concept that has been working for decades after decades. And especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, post-Cold War in 1989 and in the 90s, we saw even a kinder world. A world where Europe, again, was united, and we saw an unparalleled economic development also globally. Unparalleled development. Just look at the figures. And this is back to the theme, a global outlook from Norway in a disruptive world. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And my thesis is that the opportunity is to stay on course. Just don't fix what is not broken, because we have seen a development during the last decades that is unparalleled, and we have to stay that course. The big challenge these days is populism, nationalism, and also protectionism. What has happened since 1990? In 26 years. The global GDP has doubled. We are producing double as much as we did in 1990 in 2016. The global trade has increased 4 times. And I strongly believe there is a clear correlation between the growth in the global trade and the fact that we have doubled the global GDP. Since 1990, there is 2 billion more people on our planet since 1990. 2 billion. There is more people added since 1990 that there lived on our planet in the year of 1900. And at the same time, as we have added 2 billion people, we have reduced the amount of people globally living in extreme poverty from 40% to 20%. When Kofi Annan launched the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000 and said that by 2015, we're going to halve the amount of people in the world living in extreme poverty, people said, oh, this is impossible. It's another UN declaration. 2012, we had already halved the amount of people living in extreme poverty, 3 years before. This is due to an extraordinary growth in many emerging economies. In these emerging economies, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. What is really at stake now in 2016 in a disruptive world with challenges and opportunities is that there are, for the first time in my political life, real forces that want to change this working order that we have had since 1945. That we are in a win-win world. What is good for you is good for me. We have to make sure that in the coming 25 years, we will also be able to double the global GDP. Then we have to continue to trade with each other. We cannot have this protectionism. And on top of this, we have challenges related to security that we did not have before. I'm coming back to that. But just to also get inspired by what we have succeeded with. In 2008, the world was close to the brink economically. The fall of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 was totally surreal. In 2 months, world leaders came together and avoided that we ended up in a depression like in the 30s, but we went into a great recession. But because world leaders came together, agreed on unparalleled initiatives, like a fiscal policy that stimulated the world economy that we have not seen before. The Chinese stimulated their economy in 3 months by more than $600 billion US. And we saw zero interest rates in many countries very, very fast. This ensured that we were not ending up like in the 30s. And what was the perspectives with the 30s? In the 30s, the global GDP in very few years fell with 25%. The global trade fell by 50%, and we had mass unemployment in the world as a result. Today, 2016, the global GDP is higher than it was in 2008. We are trading more with each other, but at the same time, we are seeing sneaking protectionism measures taken by many countries. Without the WTO, I think we would have been a lot worse off. But in this world, where we really know how to fight for the world order that has brought us so much good, and that needs to be explained, because populism, nationalism, and protectionism is very, very easy to argue for, but we have to also show the consequences. If we now go into a situation where countries stop trading with each other, protectionist measures are taken, we will see lower global GDP, we will see less jobs, and we will see also increased insecurity. And these are the insecurity challenges that we are also facing at the same time. For the first time since the Second World War, one European country has broken international law and taken a piece of another European country, not according to what is the UN Charter. Ukraine. There was no discussion about the borders of Ukraine. Quite the contrary. Budapest Memorandum from '94, where Ukraine handed over all their nuclears to Russia. There was an agreement on the borders. Part of Ukraine is taken. Secondly, there is a destabilization of Donbas region in Ukraine. For Norway, as the 30th largest economy in the world, a middle-sized economy, situated where we are, our first line of defense is international law. We can never compromise on international law. In addition to a more unpredictable Russia that we are dealing with together with our NATO partners and our European partners, we are also seeing new and unparalleled challenges on the south border of Europe. And this is related to development also. In the Middle East, the population has increased 4 times since 1950. In Africa, the population has increased more than 4 times since 1950. Today, the overall population in Africa is 1 billion people. In 2030, less than 15 years, it will be 1.6 billion. If we are not able to secure growth, inclusive growth, growth that is creating jobs, and Jobs that are also factoring in the limits of our planet, because we have no second planet. This is the planet we have got. We will not be successful. These challenges are staggering. We did it from 1990 to 2015. We halved the amount of people living in extreme poverty. We doubled the global GDP. We have to repeat the same if we are going to offer all these young people jobs and opportunities. If we are not successful, we will see more violent extremism. We will see more countries destabilized, like we have seen with Syria and Iraq. We need a Marshall Plan for countries in vulnerable situations. This is an investment also in our own security. It's a humanitarian imperative, but it is really showing us that what is happening other places in the world eventually also will come in your country. We saw it with the economic downturn in 2008. Some people said, oh, this is a decoupling thing. This is only happening in America. 3 months later, the crisis was worse in Europe than in America, and they overcame the bank crisis before we did because they were also more willing to take the structural changes that are necessary in a crisis. This is also related now to security. If you are not firm on international law, if you're not firm on democracy, if you're not firm on the freedom of press, freedom of speech, if you don't stand up to the values that have brought us where we are today. Norway was one of the poorest countries in Europe 100 years ago. Then we got hydro, we got maritime sector, we built on this, we developed our education system, we grew to become one of the better countries to live in the world, 30th largest economy, but all this is due to one factor that we developed in a win-win world. We could never have done this alone. We had partners in Europe, we had partners in America, we traded with each other, we used also the comparative advantages, and see the result in 100 years. We grew from being poor to be a well-off country, and we need to see more developing countries becoming middle-income countries in the future. This is really the challenge in a time of disruption. There are challenges, there are opportunities, but if we get it right, if we stick to what has been working the 50 last years, we will also be successful if we are not listening to those voices now talking about protectionism, nationalism, and launching easy answers to very difficult questions. Don't listen to those voices, because then we will not continue the amazing journey we have been on. Thank you.
Mr. Foreign Minister, Mr. Brenda, thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation and definitely given input to act for people here in the audience as well. And as a token of our gratitude from the organizer, you will get, from my colleague over there, you will get a diploma from Doctors Without Borders with a personal thank you for your contribution, and as well as chocolate from the local producer, Heimdall, to entice the memory of this day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A British newspaper this spring ran the following headline: "If the migrant crisis goes on like this, there may be no European Union for Britain to leave." Now we know there still is a European Union to leave, and that a slight majority of the British people chose to do just that. How will Britain make a success of Brexit? To provide some answers to this rather complicated question, I welcome to the stage Her Excellency, the British Ambassador to Norway, Sarah Gillett. Please show your welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an introduction. It is a real delight to be here in Arendal, and it's an honour to be speaking after your excellent Foreign Minister. And above all, I consider it a huge privilege to be thinking about global issues with such a distinguished group of keynote listeners. I think I've been given 7 minutes to talk about making a success of Brexit, and it's a challenge, sort of challenge which I love. But I think an obvious starting point is that it is clear that the decision which the British people made on the 23rd of June was a momentous one, and it's going to be for the historians to catalogue just how momentous. It will lead to change, and much detail about that change is still very unclear. But there are some important certainties, and I want to focus on those certainties this morning. Our new Prime Minister, Theresa May, in her very earliest remarks, made an enormously important and very clear statement. Brexit means Brexit, and we are going to make a success of it. There will be many elements to making a success of Brexit, but I want to focus on just 3 of them this morning. The first element is democracy and carrying out the mandate of the British people. The second element is creating new relations with Europe. And the third element is forging a new role for Britain in the world. So, first and foremost, carrying out the mandate of the British people. The referendum was all about the British people deciding their future. The question was clear. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? The campaign was conducted over months with plenty of argumentation about the issues. The vote was held. Turnout was high at 72%, and the electorate gave their verdict. A 52% majority voted to leave the European Union. And it is now the duty of the government and the Parliament to give effect to that democratic decision. I know, after spending 2 years in Norway, that this country understands very well the importance of respecting the democratic decision-making process. Norway has had 2 experiences of referenda on membership of the European Union, and as a result, successive Norwegian governments have given effect to the wishes of the Norwegian people. So as the British government sets about delivering on the UK referendum result, it is clear that success means fully respecting the democratic mandate. There will be no attempt to remain inside the European Union. There will be no attempt to rejoin the European Union. And there will be no second referendum. The priority will be to regain more control of the numbers of people who come to the UK from Europe, whilst allowing British companies to trade with the EU's single market in goods and services. And this brings me to my second element, which is all about creating new relations with Europe. The first thing to say about this is that Britain's departure from the European Union does not mean we are leaving Europe. It does mean creating new forms of relations with our European partners. The task will be complex, and it will take time. The British government will be focused on getting the best outcome, not the quickest one. The UK will not trigger Article 50 and the process for leaving the EU until the government has a clear approach and objectives. There are no timelines at this juncture. However, we do know that Article 50 will not be triggered before the end of this year, 2016. So what will success look like? Ultimately, it will be for our Prime Minister and her cabinet to determine. But what is evident to me from the early actions of the new government is that the UK will be looking for mutually beneficial arrangements that serve our intertwined interests well. The UK will not be following any other model. The position we build outside the EU will be unique to Britain. To achieve this and respect the mandate of the British people will require fresh thinking and painstaking work. We are ready for that. I do understand that this raises lots of questions for Norwegians who are not members of the EU, but are members of the European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Association. I can't yet answer questions about the form of the UK's future relations with Norway, but what I can say from my vantage point as British Ambassador to Norway is that the substance of our relationship should grow, not diminish. From everything which my embassy is currently dealing with, I want to see Norway and the UK become even stronger allies, foreign policy partners, traders, investors, friends, and neighbours. We might need some new legal documents once the UK's future arrangements with the EU have been decided, but these should underpin the extensive and growing links between us. The third element in making a success of Brexit is our role in the world. And anyone who interpreted the referendum result as the UK retreating from the world could not be more mistaken. Britain is as committed as ever to working with our international partners to achieve a safer, healthier, and more prosperous planet of the sort that the Foreign Minister has just been talking about. The UK will live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Our engagement as a NATO member is steadfast. Our contributions through membership of the G7 and G20 will remain wholly constructive. Our links with the Commonwealth are unique and dynamic. And our undertaking to spend 0.7% of our gross income on international development and 2% of our GDP on defence is enshrined in our law and means that the UK will remain engaged as an international contributor. Britain has been and always will be a trading nation, keen on entrepreneurship and innovation. We are proud to be the highest-ranked major economy for ease of doing business. And more than ever, we want to safeguard our reputation for providing an environment in which companies can prosper and pioneer for the future. The characteristics which have made Britain a world leader in financial and other services have not altered with the decision to leave the European Union, nor has our openness to business from around the globe. It is striking that on the 1st of August this year, the first rupee-denominated Masala bond to be issued outside India was arranged in London. So from what I've outlined, I hope you'll understand that the mindset of the new British Prime Minister and government and the British Public Service is to make Brexit work well for the British people and for our relationships with Europe and the global community. And from my point of view, the country and the global community that I think most about at the moment and want to work hardest on in the months to come is Norway. So I look forward to working all with you in the months ahead and keeping you all abreast of how we are succeeding in our task of making a success of Brexit. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me this morning.
Thank you so much for your enlightening words and for taking up the challenge, having 7 minutes on such a complicated question. And you will also be given a diploma from Doctors Without Borders and a personal thank you in your name. May I remind you that for the next presenters, we would like engagement from the audience. So please use the SMS service and send your question to the dedicated phone number so that we can also have a dialogue as we move forward. Our next speaker has got the perfect credentials to shed light on Bosporus' strategic role. A role it has held from ancient Greek era through centuries of Ottoman rule up till today. Mr. Mehmet Öçü, an internationally recognized authority on energy, geopolitics, finance, and investment, has built his expertise over the last 30 years in diplomacy, international organizations, and the finance and energy business. He's the founder and CEO of Global Resources Partnership in London. Among many positions, he's also the executive chair of the Bosporus Energy Club, an exclusive gathering of leaders in finance, energy, and politics across Turkey, Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa. Mehmet Ögötse, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
I fully agree with the foreign minister when he said what happens in other parts of the world, he named Brazil, will affect us in this globalized world. But I want to bring you closer to a geography called the region around the Bosphorus, which is very important, not only for Norway, but for global interests and concerns. And perhaps I will also discuss a little bit about Turkey, because recently it has hit the headlines because of the recent military religious coup attempt, as well as new partnership forging between Ankara and Moscow. But before doing so, I'd like to thank the organizers and appreciate the opportunity given to me to address here in this beautiful town of Arendal, which I understand has become a hub, not only for leisure and holiday makers, but also for knowledge sharing type of the meetings that you organize here in Arendal Forum, but also for technology, oil and gas service industry, innovation. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. And from earlier discussions with colleagues here, I have come to the conclusion that I know less about Norway than many Norwegians know about Turkey and the region around the Bosphorus. So we, I think, have about 20,000 guest workers from Turkey here, but more than 280,000 Norwegian tourists going to Turkey every year. So there is some bond between the two countries. Although I don't think that Norway is critical for Turkey, nor Turkey is critical for Norway. However, because of the global connections that the foreign minister mentioned, whatever happens there, sooner or later, come all the way here, as we saw in the case of the Syrian crisis and refugees flooding around the world. We hosted around 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and a couple of millions already passed through the agency to Europe, coming all the way even to Arendal, as I understand. So what I will try to do in the next 3.5 hours that the moderator kindly offered me to speak, and I have about 375 slides that I will be able to share with you, is first tell you a little bit to give a taste of what are the challenges we are facing in the region around the Bosphorus. It's not like the challenges you face in Norway, because I was asking my taxi driver coming from the airport, what are the most important problems in Norway, so that I understand, so that compare. So she only listed a couple of them. One is, the refugee crisis, which is not as serious as we have in Turkey, but still, I think it was a bigger problem last year than this year. And secondly, declining oil prices, affecting their, of course, economy and livelihood. And also unemployment problem increasing, especially among the highly skilled and highly paid engineers and other white-collar people. But what I will list to you perhaps could look like a fiction looking from Oslo. One big problem we have right now in the region is the Syrian crisis, still unfolding. More than 300,000 people died, and perhaps these are official figures, even more than so. And there is no prospect of this slowing down. This is also creating a cancer, spreading a cancer called ISIS, not only in Iraq and Syria, where it originated, but coming all the way to our capitals, terrorizing us, killing hundreds of innocent people. And Iran also emerging as a major actor now, following the lifting of the sanctions, and not only in oil and gas, which is among the largest countries in the world, but also as a geopolitical actor. And it is on the chessboard of the Gulf now. We know the confrontation with Saudi Arabia. It might become quite dangerous, especially for the Strait of Hormuz, which is very critical for the freedom of navigation, around 17 million barrels of oil passing through this strait. If anything happens there, you will be affected here in Arendal as well. But Iran is also a power to reckon with in Syria, in partnership with Moscow, and working very closely with China. And also the relations between Ankara and Moscow has become a critical factor to watch carefully. Because historically, Turks and Russians fought 13 times in the history, and we have been defeated in each of them. And now, the relations before November 2015, when Turkish F-16s shot down Russian Su-24 on the Turkish-Syrian border because they violated our airspace several times, 40 times. And the relationship came to almost a halt. There was a serious risk of confrontation between Moscow and Ankara. But this has changed. 9th of August, Erdogan went to St. Petersburg, shaking hands with Putin and agreeing on a number of new areas of cooperation, including on energy, on defense, Syria, tourism, construction, you name it. Also, it is astonishing that Putin was the first to receive Erdogan after the coup attempt in Turkey, to which I will come later on. The extent by which Turkey and the West are drifting ways. This is a very dangerous and critical development that we have to watch very carefully and take some actions to remedy this. I will mention it. And also this year, I think we commemorated the centenary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which effectively divided the Ottoman Empire after the First World War into spheres of influence between Britain and France. This is probably one of the root causes of why we have all these troubles in the region. And this also prompted the rhetoric in Turkey, especially of neo-Ottomanism, whether Turkey could be a force to reckon with in this vast territory, all the way from Caspian to Algeria and to Saudi Arabia, to Crimea, and the former Ottoman territory. This is a dream, of course, but there are people talking about that. And this also perhaps one of the problems why we are facing such challenges when Turkey is following a more activist and revisionist foreign and security policy. Also, I think this year or next year, we might be facing another serious crisis in the region. With Kurdish Regional Government of Iraq, led by President Barzani, they are persistently calling for a referendum for independence. That means KRG separating from the Iraq, federal Iraq, and establishing itself as an independent state, and then in the future, perhaps, uniting with the rest of the Kurds living in Turkey, the biggest Kurdish community we have in Turkey, in Iran, and Syria. That means Greater Kurdistan being created, perhaps with a corridor all the way to the Turkish-Syrian border, now effectively controlled by Kurdish groups, to Eastern Mediterranean. This will have a very serious security and geopolitical implication. And also, we have some large-scale energy projects, some of them on the drawing board, some of them under construction in our region, around the Bosphorus. And not all of them are moving ahead smoothly. The Southern Gas Corridor, which is critical in terms of creating a fourth corridor, energy corridor, apart from Russia, Norway, North Africa, and having a fourth corridor in terms of diversification of routes is critical. And it is going ahead, $45 billion worth of project led by BP. Statoil used to be in that, but it pulled out, and SOCAR and Turkey. It will become operational by 2018, but there's a huge risk. What happens in South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's an ongoing war, sometimes ceasefire, sometimes on the shelves, but war situation is there. It might be sparking again. And also the Russian intentions, because understandably, from the Gazprom standpoint, the Russians would like to somehow undermine the Southern Gas Corridor, because this will present a direct challenge to their monopoly, quasi-monopoly in Turkey. Gazprom controls 55% of our gas imports, and also the European markets, because we are the second largest market for Gazprom. And there is a risk that something might happen in Georgia, as happened in the past with the invasion of South Ossetia and Abkhazia by Russia. So we have to watch what's happening there. Then, after the NATO summit in Warsaw, which was one of the critical gatherings of NATO in its history, there is some movement on the Russian side, especially in the Black Sea region, reinforcing its naval forces and new troops deployment along the Ukrainian border, and also seeking an excuse to intervene in Crimea, and changing its inner team. Ivanov, Putin's longtime ally, former KGB general, and his chief of staff for long years. Now he's removed, and he's bringing new blood to his administration. So Russia doesn't seem to be deterred by Western sanctions. There is a new game being prepared. We shall see what might happen. And NATO approach of deterrence and the sanctions, unfortunately, have not worked. So there is a huge issue to deal with. And Turkey now feeling somehow pushed out, especially under Erdogan's government and after this coup attempt, is looking for some sort of convenience of not marriage but engagement at the moment. I'll be happy to discuss that with you. China, I don't think anybody mentioned so far about China. Now it's de facto the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And the greatest economic growth will come from China and India that we know, although current levels of growth rate is no longer around 13, 12% that we have become accustomed. The new normal is about 7.5%. But this is still very, very impressive. And in the future, China will continue to grow because it's also upgrading itself from the low-cost manufacturing center into a high-tech country, especially along the eastern seaboard. And the OECD average for R&D as a share of GDP, I think is around 2.2% of GDP. With China, it is going beyond that. It is much better than some of the OECD countries. So expect China to have a technological edge that will put most of the European and US companies at concern. And the other important initiative that you have to watch is China's New Silk Road initiative. That's called One Belt, One Road, and expected to generate a trade volume of $2.5 trillion over the next 2 decades for China. It's moving ahead, not without problems, but as we know, Chinese are very discreet and they don't make much noise and sound bites, about what they try to do. It is as part of China's 2050 vision that we have to watch very carefully. It has implications for the Bosphorus region because it starts all the way from Xi'an, coming through Central Asia to the Bosphorus, and from Bosphorus and to Europe. The dynamics in the energy world, as we know, is critical for Norway, having almost half of its exports from the hydrocarbon exports, and is changing. It's no longer resource scarcity. We are living through resource abundance in oil, in gas. Demand regions have changed. It's no longer OECD economies. It is Asia-Pacific soaking up most of the demand, even though their economies are slowing down. We also have new producers. It's no longer Gulf countries producing 2/3 of the world's oil, though Saudi Arabia is producing about 1/3 of the OPEC production, 10.5 million barrels per day at last count. But we have new producers coming. Brazil, thanks to Santos Basin. Iran is coming up and ramping up its production quite soon. And Iraq, if this political instability is restored and more resources, investments could be channeled, will become more or less an equal of Saudi Arabia, producing more than 10 million barrels per day. Not tomorrow, but they have the potential. It could happen. Australia has almost replaced Qatar as the world's largest LNG producer. We haven't talked a bit about Turkmenistan and East Africa, and East Mediterranean emerging as a new hub for oil and gas, but also geopolitical place. And then the levels of investment in energy are declining. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment, massive investment projects, either postponed or canceled altogether. There is also a shift from investment in oil and gas to renewables, where the hopes are very high. And energy company, or oil and gas companies, calling them oil and gas, will have no future. We have to transform them into energy companies operating across all the fuels and all the value chain. Nuclear renaissance, held back because of Fukushima, but is picking up again. Not in Europe or North America, except perhaps UK and France renovating its nuclear facilities, but in Asia-Pacific nations. In Turkey, we are planning to build 3 nuclear power plants. 2 of them are already past the stage of feasibility and under implementation. So resource nationalism is dying away because low prices. When oil prices increase, of course, then it comes back with very strong muscles. And the NOCs versus IOCs are becoming an important issue. You all remember 7 sisters from our history textbooks. Now we have 7 brothers coming up. Gazprom's, Aramco's, PetroChina, Petrobras, Petronas, KMG's, SOCAR's. They are going to become more important because they control the reserves, almost 95% of the reserves in the world. They are becoming technologically, financially, and skill-wise quite competent to challenge ExxonMobil's, Shell's, Statoil's, and all the big companies of the world. And a couple of words about the game changers in geopolitics. I mentioned some of them in the beginning, but there is a clear power shift that we all see. We have to reposition ourselves to reflect this repositioning, rethinking, and readjustment of the power moving from the West to the East. Because in the West, we are so much preoccupied with our domestic problems. Now the elections in the US, Trump or Hillary, and lame duck president, the Brexit discussion in EU, refugees, loss of competitiveness, and unemployment, racism. While in the rest of the world, important things are happening. We won't be able to shape them up. So we need to understand what these game changers are And Russia, as I said before, in sort of a marriage of convenience with Beijing, are leading the Eurasianism, to which they try to recruit Turkey as well, alongside Tehran. And Shanghai Cooperation Organization might become more important than NATO at some point, not very soon, but looking to the next 7 to 10 years. The TTIP, we also discussed, the international trading system is changing. WTO is no longer in control. Globalization suffered so many setbacks. And now we have regionalism. TTIP is one of them, but there are also regional integration projects in Asia, in the former Soviet Union, in Latin America, in Africa. And so the confrontation will continue, I'm afraid. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but there are not so many hopes on the radar when we look at it. There will be more conflict, there will be more confrontation, there will be more terrorist attacks, because the rest of the world, civilized world, are divided among themselves, are ineffective. We don't have the leaders that we used to have to rise up to this challenge. Perhaps a few words about Turkey's energy situation before I conclude. And Turkey is a huge economic power. There's no doubt about this. GDP size, again in PPP terms, is about $1 trillion. And it is the 16th largest economy in the world. We heard from the minister, Norway is the 13th, and 7th largest in Europe. It has the 2nd largest army in NATO. The strategic location, when you look at the map, you see where it is. And we have also very strong aspirations for the future to become one of the 10th largest and most competitive economies in the world. That requires huge amount of energy, which we don't have. Energy is our Achilles heel, our soft underbelly. We import 98% of our natural gas, 40% of which is in power generation, and 93% of our oil. So we heavily depend on our neighboring nations, which are more fortunate than we are. 2/3 of the world's energy is in our neighborhood, around the Bosphorus region and the Middle East. And we also, I'm telling this to show that how externally we are exposed. Turkey, like Norway, cannot afford to turn inward. We need $120 billion of investment over the next 10 years for our energy and associated infrastructure. We pay more than $50 billion for only oil and gas imports in the country, an important figure in our current account deficit. And also in renewables, which is picking up in Turkey. It will occupy an important share in our energy mix over the next 10 years, up to 30% by 2023. And still, we import them, the equipment, from Norway, from Germany, from China, and other places. So therefore, for Turkey, it's critical. And for our natural gas, oil, of course, something else. It's fungible. You can get it from anywhere. But natural gas is still, despite LNG, a regional matter. As I said, we heavily depend on Russia, but we try to diversify away from Russia. Bring it to the level of EU, which is 30% import dependency, from 55%. We have good options. Iran, the 2nd largest reserve holder of natural gas in the world. Currently, we import about 10 BCM, but it's set to increase more. And Azerbaijan, Shah Deniz 2, perhaps in the future, there will be more from Nakhchivan, from Umud, Absheron. There are many other fields that can produce gas if Russia allows them to export. And then you have Kurdistan region of Iraq. I'm sitting on the board of a company which is the largest producer in that region. So we hope to provide at least 10 BCM of gas to Turkey from there, cheaper than any other options, Russian, Iranian, and Azeri, and only 300-kilometer long pipeline without transit country unit. East Med, so you have a new discovery, Zor, in Egypt, offshore, by Eni. Then you have also Israel's Tamar and Leviathan and Aphrodite in Cyprus. Huge potential if the price is right, and also geopolitical risks involving Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus could be resolved. There's a new opening there, not only for Turkey, but through Turkey to Europe as well. Then LNG will become more and more important. Perhaps, I think I came almost to 3.5 hours promised to me. I want to say a couple of words about the recent developments in Turkey, if I may, because I understand that this is of great interest. I was in my summer house in Çeşme, close to Izmir, when the attempted coup took place. It was a huge surprise, like to many other people. In Turkey, having another coup d'etat, the last one was in 1980, and we couldn't believe. But thanks God, it failed, because this coup attempt was organized by a faction within the military and instigated by a religious group based in the US, Fethullah Gülen group. And they infiltrated almost every segment of the state since 1970s. Military, almost 60% of the generals, we were told, belonged to this group. And then in judiciary, judge, prosecutors, we saw examples of what they did in the past, but we never thought, personally, I never thought that they would be that strong in education establishment and everywhere. And if there was a coup successful as a result of this attempt, this could prove to be a disaster for Turkey, but also for Europe and for the region. Because we already live in a region of chaos. Look at Syria, Iran, Russia, Black Sea, East Med, Iraq. And if there was a chaos in Turkey, a gap of leadership, this will be a disaster. Thanks God, not thanks to military, police, or Erdogan leadership, thanks to people pouring into the streets, this was averted. Who was behind that? Who engineered it? Still there are question marks, not very clear, although we know that the strong elements of Gülenist movement was behind it. We also have a huge growth industry in Turkey about conspiracy theories. The Saudis, CIA, Russians, who did it, who supported this group. And there was also massive purge of the military officers up to generals and the journalists who work in the Gülenist publications and judges, prosecutors, 21,000 teachers. I think this is going to be a very painful process for Turkey, because how would you distinguish the innocent people from those who are really committed into this crime organization? And for the first time in the history, in a coup d'etat in Turkey, the military opened fire through F-16s and helicopters and tanks on people. Official figures about 300 people dying, but I'm sure there are more than that. But this coup attempt initially, timid the opposition, Social Democrats and also nationalist groups. This also united the country behind the wrong man, because I think everybody is associated this with the president who wants to become imperial executive president with all the powers merged under him. But this was an attack against Turkey. This was an attack against democracy. So the opposition in Turkey united in their determination to protect the democracy. But whether the current government will capitalize on it to crash on the opposition and dissenting voices, we, I think, need to see it. What I would like to say is, of course, this can be discussed at great length, is Turkey is currently at a historical crossroad. It's still too early in which direction it will go. I think the danger of the coup d'etat and its repercussions have not passed. That's the reason why perhaps the government is trying to clean up from government and military all the elements suspected of belonging to Gülen's movement. And with the restoration, hopefully, of the rule of law and trust in justice system, and all the wrongdoings could be rectified. That's our hope. But I want to say my last word about the attitude of the West. And there was a total lack of empathy. Because whatever happened there, initially they thought perhaps Erdogan engineered it. We also thought in Turkey whether it was that, but it became quite clear after the evidence emerged that this was a terrible attack against Turkey and the democracy in many ways. But the West equated this, associated this only with Erdogan rather than Turkey, saying that there is a crisis of confidence about this gentleman, his ambitions to become omnipresent and very powerful executive, crushing and crackdowning on the opposition. And this created a perception within Turkey. I think you have to see it from within Turkey rather than reading in international media or TV channels. You have to see it from within Turkey, what the perception is. Now talk to anybody in Turkey, in the street. They will say that the West deceived us. They have not come to our help at the most difficult time in our history. And of course, we are very concerned about the human rights, freedom of speech, rule of law. But in this critical time, still the danger has not passed through. And it was Putin extending hands. 3 days ago, Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, coming to Ankara. The only exception in the West was the United Kingdom. Only 2 days after the coup attempt, a European minister from the United Kingdom came and expressed his support for Turkey and solidarity for its democracy. The rest is just critics about the human rights and what's going to happen to these people. Of course, we are all concerned about this. But first things first, if the stability is not established in Turkey, there is a risk that we might be degenerating. I'm about to complete, I think, my 3.5 hours. Yes, that's the message. I think you need to understand, empathize, rather than criticizing from the sidelines, as we often do for other countries. And Turkey is a very critical country. And the region around the Bosphorus is very important, more important than Brazil, that foreign minister mentioned. It's very close to us. So we have to understand the changing dynamics there, and also understand that no longer is the old world that we live in. The power shift, technological breakthroughs, and geopolitical game changers, they are all making life quite difficult, opening new challenges, but also opportunities for us. As they say in the Chinese, there is one character which signifies opportunity and the challenge at the same time. And Norway, as a country so much respected in our region, including in Turkey, trustworthy, reliable, and a broker. This also worked in the PKK case in the past, Oslo process we had, I think could play a very effective bridging role between the West and the region around the Bosphorus. Let me finish here.
Thank you so much for a riveting talk. And there are so many points to pick up on, and there's lots of engagement as well, questions coming in. I'll just allow one short question due to time. And there's a question from Søren, and he asked, has Turkey given up its plans of joining the European Union? There is a seat, ref the Brexit presentation we just had.
Well, I think Turkey is very realistic, because we applied for membership almost 60 years ago. In Turkish tradition, engagement lasts less than a year. It has to lead to marriage. So it hasn't led to marriage, then it has become a rogue relationship. And Turkey realizes that in the near future, there is no prospect of accession to EU. And we also reflect that perhaps it's not in our interest to become within the EU. We could become perhaps in a club with Norway and UK, rather than with Russia, Iran, and China in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there's a new world in which Turkey doesn't want to get into the straitjacket of the EU, even if it's invited tomorrow. So EU has lost its credibility and also carrot and stick characters in the eyes of the Turks. Therefore, I don't expect EU accession. But still, we have the customs union with EU, which allows us the trade relationship in a very comfortable way, but also engagement in defense and security matters and internal issues. But I don't think that Turkey will join the EU, even if it's invited.
Okay. Thank you so much again for a riveting talk. And
Most
we'll
welcome.
have a rough negotiation as well next
We
time.
will.
Yeah. It is often said that Arabs remember too much history and Westerners remember too little of it. Our next speaker, a scholar of Arabic and Islam, Thomas Hegghammer, is a specialist on violent Islamism and in this context, a Westerner not lacking in knowledge of history. Hegghammer is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment and Adjunct Professor of Political Science at University of Oslo. He has published several books and articles on jihadism and has a blog called The Bored Jihadi. Is terrorism a threat to global growth? Whom better qualified to shed light on this than Dr. Hegghammer? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially at this, let's say, dramatic time. It's been a very dramatic summer. In fact, a very intense couple of years since Islamic State took a third of Iraq, and we've had this wave of plots and attacks across the world. In fact, I'd say that the past 2 years have been the most intense period in my entire career of following this phenomenon. I started working on terrorism before 9/11, so it's now over 15 years. But the past couple of years have been really quite out of the ordinary. So I figured a lot of you have been following what's been going on. You've seen all the photographs from the scenes and so on. And I think it's very important when we're kind of in the eye of the storm to try and take a step back and look at the longer trends. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. I won't be showing a lot of pictures. I'll be showing a lot of statistics and graphs and that kind of thing. It'll be kind of a nerdy presentation, but I think it's important because that's the best way for us to get a more objective sense of where we are, of why the situation is the way it is, and where we might be going in the years ahead. My bottom line today, I guess, is that that we do have a serious problem at our hands. That the jihadi movement is stronger than it probably has ever been, and that I think it will remain strong for the foreseeable future. Where should I be pointing this? Oh, there. Sorry. So yes, many of you may have seen this graph on the left. There is the number of deaths in terrorist attacks since 1970, as compiled by the main database on terrorism in the world, called the Global Terrorism Database. And you can see that there has indeed been an increase, a spectacular increase, you might say. In fact, based on this, you might conclude that the so-called global war on terrorism that's been going on since 9/11 has been an unmitigated disaster. I think there is some truth to the fact that it has been a disaster, but I don't think it's been unmitigated. And because there are some caveats to this graph that you're seeing. You have to know a little bit more about what's behind the data. And one important point here is that a lot of the increase that we've had has happened in war zones, particularly war zones in the Muslim world. In 2014, 88% of all terrorist attacks occurred in just 5 countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, and Nigeria. If you look at the top sort of segment of that curve, which is sort of the rest of the world, it doesn't change all that much in this period. The big changes occur in the war zones in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. In fact, in this whole period, in the 2000s up until today, only 0.5% of all deaths from terrorism happened in the Western world. So, to the extent that it has been a disaster, it has been a very unequally distributed one that's stricken primarily the Muslim world itself. Another point about this graph I think very few people know about, and that is that I think some of the increase is driven simply by a technicality, the methodology by which GTD collects its data. The way they do it is that they basically they scan media sources, look for evidence or reports of terrorist attacks, and then add entries to their database. So in the olden days, they did this manually. From the 19th onwards, the number of sources increased with the internet and so on. And then in 2012, they developed a web crawler so that it became automated. And they went from just a small number of sources to a very large one. This is the graph at the bottom right there. And it's very likely that at least some of the increase that we've had, especially that from after 2012, is simply a reporting. It's due to reporting. That said, I think we can tell just by looking at images from these war zones that there probably has been a real increase as well, but it might not be quite as spectacularly bad as this curve suggests. A second sort of main point is that it relates to Europe, because we're in Europe, and that's what concerns policymakers here. And that is that there has indeed been a resurgence of terrorism in Europe since the early 2000s. You can see at the graph on your upper left, at the far right side of that, you will see let's call it a slight increase from around 2000 in attacks. A little bit more uneven if you look at the deaths. I'll come back to why I think the increase is more serious than this curve suggests. But I want to focus here on what's on the left side of that curve, the big sort of mountain of terrorism in the 70s and 80s, because this graph, I'm sure many of you have seen it before, is often used to argue that people like myself, or government representatives, or others, or journalists, are exaggerating. That the problem was much worse in the past, and it's not so bad now, so we shouldn't worry about it. There's some truth to that. I think the lesson we can take away from the incidents in the past is that we can handle more violence. Our societies are robust enough to handle more violence. But I would differ about the claim that the threat today is substantially lower than it was in the past, for some of the reasons I'm going to mention now. The first thing to know about the data, and you see this in the graph on the top right side, on the upper right side, is that very much of the terrorism you had in Europe in the 70s and 80s happened in two places, in Northern Ireland and in the Basque Country. These were practically war zones where the sort of counter-terrorism measures were extremely severe, where the government repression was very harsh, much harsher than anything that governments are applying today. So to the extent that there's been a huge decrease, it's been primarily in these areas. Other countries have not experienced this, this decrease. The other point is that it's become easier, it was easier to do terrorism in the past. Especially since 9/11, our intelligence services have become much, much better. They've become much bigger as well. And as a result, security services stop many more attacks than they did in the past. In fact, of the sort of serious jihadi plots, they probably foil 80 to 90%. And those failed and foiled plots do not show up on these graphs that show executed attacks. And I guess the broader public never realizes that they were there and that they might have materialized. This is the point about interpreting the data. We cannot use executed attacks to say anything about the threat. Executed attacks is just the net production of violence after you have subtracted the countermeasures. And the threat is really the gross production of violence, or plots in this case, which is very serious. As you can see on the bottom right there, this is an overview of the most serious sort of jihadi plots over the past few years, and you can tell that most of them are fail or are foiled. You see, interestingly, in the past couple of years, the proportion of plots that come to execution has increased significantly. That's very worrying. It's related to something about the internet I'm going to talk about later on. Third, certain particularly lethal types of operations were much easier to do in the past. Think about bombs on planes. In the 70s and 80s, there were several of these, and 6 of them caused a lot of casualties. Some of them are listed on the list on the bottom left there. But from the late 80s onwards, it became almost impossible to put bombs on planes because of highly increased airport security. But that does not mean that there are not terrorists around today who wouldn't like to place bombs on planes. I don't think anyone here doubts that Islamic State, if they could, would put a lot of bombs on planes in Europe, but they can't. And so the fact that all those deaths have gone away has nothing to do with the threat. It has to do with the things we have done ourselves to counter the threat. If you look at I've listed on the bottom left the 13 most deadly terrorist attacks in European history. I just use 35 as a cutoff. And you'll see that 6 of those were bombs on planes or a hijacking in one case. Of the remaining 7, 6 have happened after 9/11. And 5 of those 7 were jihadi plots. Which leads to my next point, which is that in Europe, the main threat comes from jihadi networks. I obviously don't mean to suggest that there is no threat from other groups of other ideologies, or that we may not see more mass casualty attacks by, say, a far-right extremist. But we have to get our proportions right. And when we look at the data of the gross plot production in Europe, there is no question in my to my mind, that the greater threat comes from the jihadi groups. And this is important because I think for any security problem, we need very specific sort of countermeasures, both on the kind of the immediate countermeasures, but also for the deeper issues, the kind of the root causes of the problem. The root causes of the jihadism problem in Europe is probably going to be slightly different than the root causes of the neo-Nazi problem in Europe. I want to say a few words about terrorism data from Europol, which a segment of which I put up on the left-hand side there. I mention this because Europol data are often used to argue that jihadis represent a very small part of the terrorism picture in Europe. Especially if you go further back in the late 2000s, you'll find years when Europol says there was 1 or 0 plots by jihadi groups and maybe several hundred attacks by separatists in France or in Spain. And many people have used this to say, to suggest that we have got our proportions wrong, and that perhaps, and some are even suggesting that the focus on the jihadi threat might be inspired by Islamophobia or something like that. But here again, we have to know what's behind the data. And one important thing is that the Europol data doesn't reflect plot severity. So a plot is a plot is a plot, or an attack is an attack is an attack. And so a blown-up mailbox on Corsica, for example, by separatists, is weighted for as much as a plot to blow up 10 airliners in London, a plot we had in 2006. So the groups that do a lot of small operations, not very lethal ones, will appear as much stronger than the groups that do fewer but much more kind of potentially more lethal attacks. Another thing about Europol data is that they're very vulnerable to accidents of reporting because they rely on individual countries reporting to them what the sort of national police considers as the terrorism activity in that country that year. Different countries have different definitions of terrorism. Different countries take Europol unequally seriously. And so the data that Europol gets is very unreliable. For example, the UK, when it reports to Europol, it never distinguishes between ideological backgrounds of the attackers. So all the UK data goes into the orange part here, sort of the unknown segment. And we know that there have been several serious jihadi plots in the UK. It cuts the other way too, by the way. One huge limitation of the Europol data is that it seriously, I think, underreports the extent of far-right violence. Because in Europe today, there's a lot of sort of small-scale, relatively speaking, violence perpetrated by the far right, attacks on individual persons of color or asylum seekers, arson attacks on asylum centers and that kind of thing. That on average, these attacks don't kill many people, but there are an awful lot of them. The problem is, in many countries, these types of attacks don't make the cut for what's considered terrorism. Different countries, as I said, have different definitions, and many countries classify this as hate crime, and so it doesn't get sent to Europol. So the bottom line is that we can't use Europol data for very much. Now, about the jihadi challenge in Europe, we can say that there has been quite a significant increase in activity since 2011-12. It's been what I call a sort of jihadi resurgence in Europe. And I would say the kind of the threat level today is substantially higher than it was in the years after 9/11 in the 2000s. And we can see this just partly from the plot, although the plot increase is not huge. We can see it particularly on arrests. And here Europol data, I think, are a little bit more reliable. You see the huge increase in arrests of jihadis in the past few years. But most of all, we see it in the foreign fighter phenomenon, and the fact that 4,000 or 5,000 people have left from Europe to Syria over the past 4 or 5 years, which is probably 3, 4, 5 times more than the number of people who went as foreign fighters to all the other conflicts in the Muslim world combined, Afghanistan or Chechnya or Bosnia. And we also see it online, a lot more expressions of support for Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And just generally, I see a lot more support for Islamic State today than I ever saw for Al-Qaeda in the mid-2000s. Which of course raises the question, what is going on? Why has this happened? And I don't have the answer to that, I'm afraid. I actually don't. There is no clear answer. It's a bit of a puzzle, this massive increase in activity we've had in the past 5 years. But there are, I highlight 4 factors which I think likely contributed. And we get a first clue by looking at the profiles of jihadis in Europe. People who carry out attacks, or we can also include the foreign fighters themselves. And while this is a very varied population, that you have a little bit of everything. You have young and old, you have men and women, you have converts and people of immigrant background, you have rich and poor, you have it's a heterogeneous group, but still we can talk about median characteristics. And as a group, jihadis in Europe are socioeconomically underperforming. And I say this because there's a widespread perception that poverty has nothing to do with jihadism, that look at bin Laden, he was rich, and look at this and that plot leader in Europe, he went to a good school. These are anecdotes. If you look at the data as a whole, the large numbers, there's absolutely no doubt that the average jihadi in Europe is in the lower half of the socioeconomic ladder. I know of no study, no reliable study that looks at a large number of European jihadis that finds that they are performing above the average. And in fact, their performance have decreased over the years. So the population of foreign fighters in Syria is a much more ragtag group than the ones that were attacking in Europe in the 2000s. For example, it was a recent, the best study we have is a German one, done by the German government. They looked at the 677 German foreign fighters in Syria. One of them had completed a university degree. Another study of Dutch militants found that none of them, they had 140, an N of 140, none of them had completed a university degree. Most of them had just completed the middle school or high school. And a lot of them had social issues. Almost half of them had a prior criminal conviction, and 8 of them were homeless at the time of radicalization. What does this mean? Does it necessarily mean that poverty is driving this whole thing? No, obviously not. There are lots of poor people, Muslims and non-Muslims, that don't become terrorists. But I do think that it predisposes, and I think we have to realize that we have an economic underclass in Europe where Muslims are overrepresented. And that there are areas in economically deprived areas in Europe where Muslims are in a large minority. I think the causal mechanism here is probably not frustration about being poor. I don't think anyone sort of sits around and thinks, oh, I'm so poor. I look at these white people who have a little money. I'm so angry, I'm going to blow myself up. No, that's not. I don't think that's how it works. I think it works through other mechanisms. For example, time. If you're unemployed, you have a lot more time at your hands engaging in kind of religious activity or browsing on the jihadi websites or doing things like that. Or if you're poor, you're more likely to live in an area where criminal networks are around and where you can more easily get guns and where sort of gang issues are more prevalent, that kind of thing. But the point is, I think there is a socioeconomic dimension to jihadism in Europe, and we have to face it. And by the way, this is entirely in line with a recent big sort of theoretical breakthrough in terrorism studies that kind of solves this sort of puzzle we've had for a while, which of kind of contradicting data with the fact that terrorists in the Middle East are often middle class. And this theory provides an explanation for why we should expect terrorists in poor countries to come from the middle classes and terrorists from rich countries to be from the lower levels of society. And that has to do with we call the resource threshold, that you have to have a certain amount of intellectual and economic resources to be politically active, to even care about politics. And if you're in India, for example, perhaps the lower kind of you have to be at the 50th percentile of income to even be politically active. If you're below that, you're too busy trying to get food on the table. But in the West, the absolute level of material living standard is so high that almost everyone is above that threshold, and so you find that terrorists from in the segment just above that threshold. I think that's the nerdiest point in the presentation. Another factor here is, of course, something more immaterial, the ideology, and what we can observe is that there has developed in Europe a very elaborate subculture, and this is what it is. Jihadism is a subculture or a counterculture, and this culture provides recruits with a strong sense of identity. It provides them with a lifestyle, with a whole sort of body of kind of cultural products of music, poetry, film, a whole collection of films, and the point about all this sort of jihadi culture is that it has an aura of authenticity to it. So it's not taken out of thin air, this stuff, like some of the kind of ideas in, say the skinhead movement or the far right. These ideas, the cultural elements in that movement are basically inventions, modern inventions. But a lot of what the jihadis do or consume have some kind of root, in tradition. They have some precedent in history, and so they have an aura of authenticity to them, which is appealing, especially I think to Muslims in the diaspora, who we know often struggle with this identity issue of being torn between the culture of their parents and the culture of their host country, and some feel that they don't fit in either. So this subculture provides them with that identity, and it also provides, of course, with companionship in the underground. And when you join a radical group, you develop strong attachments to your buddies. A third factor, which I think that is probably the least known, and that is a change that happened on the internet about 5 years ago. Basically, around 2010-11, it became much easier to be an extremist or terrorist online. what we call the repression. I mean, the degree to which governments kind of police and control, block sites, arrest users. This repression was started going up, so it was lifted, and people, extremists were starting to be able to do things online that would have gotten them into serious trouble just years before. So I've called this a digital empowerment revolution, and it happened around 2010 for the reasons I don't have time to go into. But the point is that terrorists had a lot of trouble using the internet for operations and that kind of thing up until 2010, but have been able to do it extensively since 2010. And they can communicate. A lot of them they communicate safely. They show fewer concerns or worries about being tracked or observed. They trust each other when they communicate online more. They trust the technology they're using more, and they're starting to incorporate digital technology into the operational phase, which they didn't before because they didn't trust the technology. And now we have had several instances, for example, in Paris last year, where mobile phones are used to coordinate the attacks while it happened. In the past, they didn't actually do that because they were worried that it might foil the whole operation. But they have much more confidence in the technology now than they used to do. I see I'm running out of time. I'll just say that the final and probably the most fundamental driver behind what we're seeing in Europe is the wars in the Middle East. The fact that we've had more insurgencies and more jihadi insurgencies, especially in Syria and Iraq, but also, of course, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in Nigeria, and more recently in Yemen and Libya and so on. So in the past 5 years, there's been not an explosion, but a significant increase in the number of jihadi insurgent groups in the region, and this has a big effect on the activity in the West. And the main mechanism linking the two is, of course, foreign fighter activism. That when there is a war in the region, people in Europe want to go there, and then they come back and bring in new ideas, expertise, and so on. And we have to bear in mind that the organizations that are running the show, like IS, they are products of these wars. So unlike what Trump says, it wasn't Obama who created IS, but it was the two wars, the Iraq War and the Syria War, that created Islamic State. Without those two things, IS would not exist, and the movement would be a lot weaker today. Finally, my last slide, which is about the prospects, and the idea here is that I think the future of the European jihadi movement its fate is closely tied to the fate of the jihadi movement in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, and that fate looks rather bright. There are some very strong forces pushing in the wrong direction in the Muslim world. One has to do with money, with oil, with the oil price. That, as you can see at the top left corner, it shows the fiscal break-even price for oil, and it's basically too low to keep some of these economies going. I think it's particularly worrying for a country like Iraq, and more longer term is worrying for Saudi Arabia. Another force is the pervasive authoritarianism in the region. Bottom left, you have the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, which looks bad. Red is bad. You have the youth bulge, which combined with poor economies produce very high, the world's highest youth unemployment rates. And then you have the pervasive, or the continued popular appeal of Islamist ideas. On the far right corner here, I'll show you some things that scare me quite a bit. These are basically poll results done by Pew, so they're quite reliable, show the support in various Muslim countries for Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And, or support, they ask, do you have a positive opinion of this group? And you can say, well, they're a minority of the entire population, but when you look at the number of people, it's staggering. So 14% of the Nigerian population has a good view of IS. Nigeria is 150 million people. Or 15% of the Indonesian population has a positive view of Al-Qaeda. Indonesia is 250 million people. 25% of the Palestinian population has a positive view of Al-Qaeda. These are, and that's just, and this is the far end of the landscape. If you ask about more generally about religious conservatism, you have much higher numbers. So, on the whole, I see kind of jihadi insurgencies in the region as if not endemic, then likely to feed on themselves for quite a long time ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a highly interesting talk. And I know there are questions from the audience, but I know you'll join us for lunch. So due to time, I think that we can engage in those questions during lunch. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you. So before we go to lunch now, we will shift our focus slightly from geopolitics and over more to the sustainability environment. Making money while doing good for the greater society was the main theme for the first Global Outlook conference. And our next speaker is not merely concerned about understanding and predicting the driving forces, but also aimed to be part of the solutions created by those forces. Kevin Moss is the Global Director of the Business Center in World Resource Institute, focusing on how businesses can transform sustainability into robust business growth strategies. Please welcome Mr. Kevin Moss.
Thank you. Helene, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the gentleman who just straightened my collar. And thank you very much to all the organizers for including me here today. I'm honored to be amongst such distinguished company, the Minister, Ambassador, and all of the other very distinguished and knowledgeable speakers who have come before me and are coming after me, and all of you in the audience for being here and allowing me and giving me the space to speak. Thank you. I'm with WRI, the World Resources Institute. We are a global research and analysis organization. We have our roots as a think tank, and we also put our ideas into action. So, for example, if you've heard of the GHG protocol, the Global Protocol for Accounting for Carbon, that's something that was developed by WRI, and we still run and manage. We have a big platform called Global Forest Watch that provides minute-by-minute real-time analysis of deforestation around the world. I run an action program with the Institute that works with businesses to try and be an agent for change within the private sector. And you'll see some of that come through. I'll talk broadly on behalf of the Institute, but you'll probably see some of my business perspective come through. As I am here, I should also thank the Norwegian government, who from a couple of different departments provide us with some critically needed funding that allows us to do some of the analysis that's behind some of the things I'm going to talk about today. My topic today is to talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. I'm going to do it within the context of business and of countries looking forward to tomorrow's markets. I think you're going to see a theme running through of paradox, of contrasts and dilemmas. The problems we have ahead of us are hard, but I stand between you and lunch, and I hope that by the time of lunch, I'll not only show you that they're hard, but I'll show you that we can thread that needle and that some of those paradoxes and have solutions, and there is a way through this. It's a time of paradox on the global stage. We've seen signs of unprecedented global cooperation, and in some ways the last 12 months has really been a very special time. The encyclical from the Pope calling on nations around the world to work together and supported by many other religions. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals in the fall that came to effect on January the 1st, 193 states signed up to those goals. I believe that is the most cooperation and agreement that the UN has ever achieved on anything since World War II. The Paris Agreement, 180 companies have signed up to the Paris Agreement. Signs of a true understanding between nations that there is an interdependence upon each other and that one person's success, as the minister said this morning, is very much dependent on another country's success as well. But we know there is a paradox out there, and in parallel we're seeing this incredible rise of nationalism in the US, in Europe, in the UK, where with a withdrawal from region-wide perspectives, international level views with elements of protectionism and the raising of barriers. We see contrasts in business and financial markets as well. Similar sorts of paradoxes. On the one hand, we see very positive signals over the last year or so. New Climate Economy was a piece of work WRI coordinated with a half a dozen universities around the world, involving representatives, economists from developing nations as well as developed nations, politicians, businesses, and it showed us that not only can we tackle climate change without compromising the economy, we can actually tackle climate change as a route to growing the economy. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, brought increased awareness to the formal investor community with his statements that's led to the formation of the Financial Disclosure Board, that's looking at how companies in the financial sector can disclose their climate risks so investors can take them into account. In Paris, institutional investors committed $600 billion to acting on climate. That's not enough. We need trillions of dollars, but it's a great start. And corporate action was a vehicle to the agreements in Paris and at the SDGs, with corporations speaking out to government and showing their support. But what's the other side of this contrast? Sustainability is still not a priority for boards. This comes from America, but I think it reflects many other countries as well, this particular survey, who, if they do pay attention to sustainability, generally see it as something that gets discussed once a year as a separate issue. Many industries are still resisting change. If they're not doing it themselves directly, they're doing it quietly through their trade associations, and in various regions around the world, we see resistance to progress by governments from policy influence from trade associations. And I would say that the challenge we have is exacerbated by this problem, that we're still in a consumption-driven economy. Our traditional models of GDP growth require more consumption, and I'm going to use a very technical term here, more consumption of more stuff. And I use that word stuff very, very intentionally as a term that describes things containing materials rather than services. We grow the economy, we grow consumption, we consume more stuff. And this is developed economies very much leading the way on this pattern. As developed economies look to recatalyze growth, we see a celebration of a rebound in shopping. We want people to go out to the shopping malls, as I call them in Britain, and malls, as I now pronounce it as an American. Whether it's doing that or whether it's encouraging more online shopping and whether it's using new technologies like drones and autonomous vehicles that are going to bring new things to our front door the moment we wanted them, or perhaps even before we knew we needed them. We're using technology, in some cases, to drive an increase in consumption. And developing countries that are looking to also grow economically are looking to emulate those Western developed forms of growth. There's a global need for action here, and developed economies really need to take their part in that. I'm going to move on to the SDGs now, because I think this tension is really inherent in the SDGs, in the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who are not familiar with them, this is a very brief overview. The SDGs consist of 17 goals that cover the gamut of issues that the UN and all of the participating 193 countries really felt we needed to tackle over the period of now through to 2030 to replace the MDGs that they took the place of. The 17 goals consist of 169 targets. That is pretty daunting. And it can seem, and in some ways is, overly complex. So I think we need a bit of a narrative to help us understand our way through it. This is my perspective of a narrative to help us a little bit to understand the SDGs. I've picked out a few to illustrate, but really the narrative through this applies across the piece. This represents a seesaw that you'd see in a child's playground, and on the left-hand side of this are some of the SDGs that are associated with economic growth and social well-being, bringing people out of poverty, providing work, bringing people out of hunger. On the left-hand side are some of those SDGs associated with the environment, ensuring we have sustainable water supplies, a stable climate, land, and we reduce deforestation. And as we bring people out of poverty, on the left-hand side of this seesaw, if we don't pay attention to consumption, in this process, we compromise the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, on the right-hand side of this. And I think that key to this balance is SDG number 12, responsible consumption and production. So this is one way I give you, I'm sure there are other ways, but one way I'd like to give you of thinking about and understanding the SDGs. And I would argue that if you try to approach the SDGs without thinking of this narrative and addressing it, you haven't really addressed the spirit of what's been put together here. So if you say, for example, well, I'm a company and I provide jobs and I grow the economy, if you haven't done that without paying attention to and addressing the issue of use of natural resources, you haven't really addressed the SDGs. And I'll come back and talk about that a little more later. So how can we look at this? What ways are there of looking into the future and making some sense of this? And I'll put forward this idea of asking the question, well, what do tomorrow's markets look like? It's some very dangerous ground trying to predict tomorrow's markets a year out, let alone 15 years out, 2030, when the SDGs are due to conclude. But let me put some proxies out there of some ways of thinking about it. And I'm going to start off by saying, as we bring people out of poverty, we need to feed people, we need to cool people if they live in hot climates, or on the other side, warm them if they live in cold climates, and we need to clothe people. So let's just, if we take a quick look at each of those, we need to feed people. WRI has produced a report earlier this year, Shifting Diets for a Sustainable Food Future, that showed us that by 2050, we have to be able to close a 70% calorie gap in the calories available to feed the world. Not just the growing world, but the increasingly affluent, or certainly decreasingly poor world that's going out to 2050. We have to close a 70% calorie gap. That means from the available land and water, we have to produce 70% more calories than we do today. That's in a world that currently uses basically the extent of arable land that is available. Because if we use more arable land, we generally have to cut down forests for it, which creates another problem. So with the current land, coming out of a couple of decades of unprecedented improvements in production, we've got to produce 70% more calories. And we've got to do that in a world that doesn't really trust new technologies like GMOs at the moment. And we can't just throw more water and nutrients at the problem, because we've got water problems and nutrient runoff problems as well. So these are the sorts of lines we need to look at as we try and tackle these problems. We need to cool people. And the corollary of this, we need to warm people in other climates as well. This is the predicted growth of air conditioners in China, Mexico, and India. India, for example, at the moment has about a 5% penetration of air conditioners and is looking to, and we want, a massive growth in the middle class. Each of those air conditioners that go towards replicating the model we've already set up in the West consumes vast amounts of electricity if they are consumed and used the way we are today. So we will be putting out there now air conditioners that are going to be out there for 10, 15 years consuming energy like we do today, in a world in which we are trying to reduce carbon emissions by 70, 80, 90% out to 2050. So we're seeing this sort of growth in the product while we're looking for this sort of decline in the carbon emissions produced. And we need to clothe people. I've used a T-shirt as an example here, but it could apply to any piece of apparel, really. It takes 400 to 700 gallons of water currently to produce a T-shirt, and about 2 kilograms of carbon to produce a T-shirt. In order to clothe people as they come out of poverty and they increase their demand, and in order to clothe the growing population, we need to at least double the productivity. We need to get double the production of apparel out of the same amounts of water, the same amounts of land, and the same amounts of carbon. So those are the sorts of things we can see as we look towards tomorrow's markets and an increase in consumption against the decrease in resources we need. What we have to do is break that link between economic well-being and increasing consumption. So I'm going to move on to a little bit of good news for you. And there are reasons to be hopeful. First of all, in the private sector, every challenge, as long as it can be monetized, is a revenue opportunity for somebody. There are companies out there that are looking for those revenue opportunities and that are seeing these problems as challenges. And there are some great solutions. We currently live in an economy that we can describe as a linear economy. We take stuff out the ground. We make something with it. Waste, we put whatever's left over into a landfill. With recycling, we've started to build a circle so that waste can be reprocessed and become the raw material to start off a new circle. We need to tighten and tighten and tighten that circle so that we're not using a lot of energy to reprocess materials, but instead we are actually reusing items or fixing items. This particular picture shows a shoe store and a cobbler repairing a shoe. This was an example that was actually very real for me about 6 weeks ago when I had a pair of shoes that needed new heels and new soles. I'd take my shoe off and show you, but I'm not sure if that's polite in all cultures, so I'm not going to do it right now. And I took them into a cobbler, and it cost me more to have that pair of shoes repaired than it would have to buy a new pair of shoes, significantly more, because that involved labor, much more labor than it involves to make a new pair of shoes. I particularly like this solution because this solution addresses that problem, that tension within the SDGs. In addressing the issue of environment and protecting resources by reusing goods, we're also creating work. So it's a solution where the solution doesn't compromise a different SDG, but the solution to one problem actually helps another one of the SDGs. And there are many other complementary solutions. This is one that shows the link between water and energy. In Saudi Arabia, 25% of the energy produced from fossil fuels goes to desalinating water. So the more we can save water, we automatically save energy as well. And it takes energy to produce water as well, so the more we can reduce our need for energy, the more we can reduce our call on limited water supplies. So what are we seeing since the earlier part of this year? Countries, since Paris, are maintaining their momentum. This is a chart that shows the outcome and the next steps from Paris. In order for the Paris Agreement to take effect, 55 countries representing at least 55% of emissions have to formally join or ratify the agreement. So far, as of when we did this chart a few days ago, when we last updated it, the 22 countries shown in dark blue, thank you Norway, have already joined the agreement. We see another 24, which are shown in light blue on this chart, that have either publicly committed to joining this year, or they've already completed their domestic process that will enable them to join. And that gets us to the 46 countries representing just over 50% of emissions that you can see here. We need to get to 55. We think there are enough countries that have expressed their intent to head in that direction or showing signals that it could well happen before the end of this calendar year. It could possibly happen before the next COP, which is in Marrakesh in 2 months. Those are pretty optimistic views, but we think it is very likely to happen within the first part of next year for sure. And that's much more optimistic than we might have been a year ago, or even after Paris. So the momentum we see is doing very well. Moving over to the corporate side, CEOs are recognizing the risk. This is the outcome of a survey completed at the last World Economic Forum where CEOs were asked free-form to name the top risks facing their companies over the next 10 years. Every one of these you will see relates to the SDGs, either environment or social issues. That is really encouraging. It's not good that this is the situation, but it's encouraging that CEOs are recognizing it. This is in contrast to that slide earlier, where I showed the boards, and that boards are not really spending much time on this. I think one of the reasons is this is their 10-year outlook. Their 18-month outlook of risks is significantly different, and we all know the tension between long and short term that businesses face. There is momentum for ambitious corporate sustainability action. These are some of the targets and goals that have been set in climate, in food, in water, and in deforestation by large groups of companies. One that I'm particularly excited about is this concept of science-based targets, where we look to where a company says, well, I'm working on reducing my carbon emissions. If I'm going to do that, I need to understand the problem. What's the problem I'm trying to solve? Catastrophic climate change. If I'm going to reduce my carbon emissions, I need to reduce them enough to resolve catastrophic climate change. And Science-Based Targets is a joint initiative of WRI with the Carbon Disclosure Project, with the World Wildlife Fund, and with the UN Global Compact that has created a methodology that if all companies follow the same methodology, the corporate world will do its part to get us onto a 2-degree path or better. You can see here 170 companies have publicly committed to setting science-based targets, and 18 already have their targets announced and approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative as being consistent with a 2-degree or better temperature change. The area has become of such interest, we're starting to work on this same concept of actually doing enough to solve the problem in the areas of water and land as well. These are a few companies I wanted to highlight, and there are only a few that have come up with targets that I think respond to the challenge, that tension, the challenge set by the SDGs, by talking about how they're going to grow their business and how they're going to grow their business within the context of reducing their environmental footprint. So let me leave you with a few thoughts on what needs to come next. What I think needs to come next, because there really are, as I said, only a few companies in that group that I showed you just now. I think companies and governments need to move from evolution to transformation, from incremental change to more transformative change, from feasible-based change to solution-based change. What is the problem that I'm trying to solve? And I'd like to propose 3 ways that companies and countries can think about their targets and their levels of ambition. First of all, what I'll call reimagine, don't rewrap. We're very good at taking what we're doing already and rewrapping it within the new framework, whether it's shared value, circular economy, shared or the SDGs, saying, well, here's what I'm doing, this is what it looks like within the new set of frameworks. It's really important to reimagine what is wanted by that new framework. What is different about it than what came before it? And as I've said, for the SDGs in particular, it's really understanding and addressing that tension within them. Secondly, think long-term, look ahead to the end game. This is an illustrative chart of carbon reductions. The orange line gets us to where we need to be by 2050. The blue line gets us to where we need to be by 2025, perhaps 2030, and can lull us into a full sense of security as we put out into the marketplace products that look okay by 2025 or 2030, or we build infrastructures for energy or transport that get us to where we need by 2025 or 2030, but leave us in a decade's time not knowing how we're going to get where we need to by 2050 because we've built ourselves into an infrastructure that doesn't get us there. So look ahead to the end game. And thirdly, look downstream. I think countries are very good at looking within their national boundaries and taking responsibility for what happens within their own national boundary with carbon emissions, with consumption, with recycling, but not paying much attention to what happens to their product when it gets outside of their national boundary and is used by others. I think companies equally are very good and have been excellent at reducing their operational footprint and also reducing the footprint in their supply chain. But we now need to build on that and really look forward into what's the product I'm building? What market am I building this product for? Does this business model have a place in a sustainable future in 2030 that meets the needs of the SDGs, or 2050 that meets the needs of what's come out of Paris? Reimagine, don't rewrap. Look ahead to the end game and look downstream. I want to leave you with the thought, we're here in parallel with the Olympics. So I just want to leave you with one thought from that. In 1965, high jump had reached an impasse. Athletes had exhausted the potential of a jumping style called scissor jumping. I was going to show you it, but I don't think I can. Where one leg would go over the bar first, the athlete would predominantly stay upright and the other leg would follow. And it was because new athletes were finding it impossible to set new records because they'd pretty much, whatever they did, they had reached the potential of that jumping style. A jumper named Dick Fosbury came along, created a new and innovative style that completely transformed the high jump. He ignored previous traditions, and like this jumper here, this is a more recent picture of a Swedish jumper, he hurled himself over the bar, head first and facing the sky. This is what we see now in high jump, but this wasn't what we saw in high jump back in '65. It was crazy, transformational, everybody thought he was crazy. And he beat the previous record that athletes had been failing to beat for many years by a massive 6 inches, a complete change to what was expected in high jump. That's what we need to do to rise to the challenges and the responsibilities of the Paris Agreement and of the SDGs to bring people out of poverty around the world without compromising the resources of the planet for future generations. We need to deliver that equivalent level of transformation by hurling ourselves over that bar, head first, so we're still thinking and looking to the sky. Thank you very much.
Thank you for an inspirational and enlightening talk just before we head into lunch. And I know you'll be joining the lunch, so please engage with the speakers that we didn't have time to engage with during the session. Lunch will be served for those of you who have prepaid up on the second floor, and then we'll meet again back here at 1 o'clock sharp. Looking forward then to new and different perspectives as well, which will take us further into the theme of today. Thank you.
Houston was working hard on that. I think for this reason, government will put a great deal of effort making it security-wise satisfactory. But people will have question marks in their mind before coming. They need to be assured that everything will be okay. But in terms of personal safety, I think this is there might be some loss. But until then, perception might change depending on how because PKK, ISIS, they step up their bombing and activities again. So what part of Schlumberger?
I'm in corporate.
Because I have a friend on the board, a fellow board member, Shakib, Genel Energy. He told me that he was with you before.
Yes, it's true. Well, he wasn't with me. I worked for him. So a little bit different relationship, but tremendous amount of respect.
He's a very nice chap.
So you know him long?
Well, I mean, we sit on the board for the past 2 years. We are good friends now. And I didn't know him before.
Well, if you see him, give him my regards.
I will, certainly.
Thank you.
What's his first name? Last name?
So do I need to do anything now?
No, just be here 5 minutes before and then he will assist you with the presentation so you get the final one.
Yeah. It's on there, but if you could
We'll
put the
see.
final
Yeah,
one too,
yeah,
that'd be great.
yeah.
knows a colleague of mine called Christopher Delgado, who had introduced this briefly in his own company. Chris Delgado. I think he's a fellow with us. Yes, I think he's a fellow. What's his? Yes. Do you know him from some other?